This is a homily for the fourth Sunday in Ordinary Time. The Gospel for this Sunday comes from the Gospel of St. Mark, chapter 1, verses 21 to 28. Here I am, seated at my computer, about to begin work on a novel that I've decided to call The Great Adventure. Like all novels, it must have a plot. The plot is the series of events that make up the story. It acts as the main structure that holds the story together. The plot gives the narrative its meaning and direction, and it must evoke curiosity and suspense in the reader. Why did that happen? Why is this happening? What is going to happen next, and why? Last Sunday we looked at the plot of Mark's Gospel, the structure that holds the story together. The Gospel begins with a brief prelude of 13 verses. The prelude consists of the proclamation of John the Baptist. Jesus is baptized by John in the River Jordan. And finally, Jesus is driven by the Spirit into the desert for 40 days, and there he is tested by Satan. We then have an account of Jesus' ministry in the Galilee region. Then Jesus and the disciples begin the journey to Jerusalem for the feast of Passover. Jesus enters the holy city of Jerusalem on the day that we now celebrate as Palm Sunday. Mark's Gospel then gives us a day-by-day account of this last week in the life of Jesus. Who are the characters in my great adventure? The central character of Mark's Gospel is, of course, Jesus himself. Then we have the disciples, especially the 12. In last Sunday's Gospel, Jesus called the first of his disciples, Peter and Andrew and James and John. In addition to the disciples, we have Jewish and Roman authorities. They are united by their common opposition to Jesus and the reign of God. We then have the minor characters in the Gospel, such as the man possessed by an unclean spirit whom we meet in today's Gospel. These minor characters do not play ongoing roles in the story. They make brief appearances and then disappear. However, the brevity of their appearance, and in most cases their anonymity, in no way diminishes their importance in the Gospel story. Integral to any plot is the setting. So, where shall I set my story about the great adventure? Is the story to be set in the present time, or in times past, or perhaps sometime in the future? And what worldview is presupposed in the story that I am about to tell? So, where will the story be set? Maybe in Central Australia, somewhere near Uluru. My intrepid adventurer will befriend the local indigenous people who take him under their wing and teach him how to live off the land, as they have done for thousands of years. Or maybe I'll set the great adventure in the snowfields, with our hero skiing down a mountain pursued by enemy agents on motorbikes especially equipped for the snow. Or maybe our hero will lead an African safari, encountering ferocious animals in the wild. Or how about an adventure at sea? What would happen if the liner were to hit an iceberg and slowly begin to sink? I wonder if that story has ever been told before. What about our hero upstaging Indiana Jones amid the ruins of ancient and exotic civilizations? Or perhaps I should stick to a setting that I'm more familiar with. So how about an adventure set in a city? Or an adventure in outer space? Or I could set the great adventure in a war zone, with my hero ready to defeat terrorists intent on downing a civilian aircraft. Or our hero could be a scientist dedicated to discovering a vaccine for a virus that has been maliciously released by a rogue state. In each of these hypothetical scenarios, the setting would undoubtedly be a crucial and integral part of the plot. Let's now look at the setting of today's Gospel. Jesus and his disciples have reached Capernaum, a fishing village on the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee. It was the hometown of Peter and Andrew and James and John. Capernaum is mentioned 16 times in the Gospels and was apparently the closest to a permanent base that Jesus had during the Galilean ministry. The Sea of Galilee is not really a sea, but a large freshwater lake, 21 kilometres from north to south and 12 kilometres wide at its broadest part. Here you can see what remains of Capernaum today. This site was abandoned after the Arab invasion in the 7th century AD, and its ruins were covered over and forgotten. Its location was rediscovered in 1838 by Edward Robinson, the professor of biblical literature at Union Theological Seminary in New York. Until 1968, no remains of the Capernaum that Jesus knew were visible. The first excavations were conducted by Charles Wilson in 1866, but it was only after 1894, when the entire area was purchased from local Arabs by the Franciscan custody of the Holy Land, that archaeological work was carried out on a larger scale. The prominent building that you can see to the left of this photo is a Franciscan friary. The most important findings were the remains of a synagogue and the remains of the house of Peter. These are the ruins of a synagogue dating from the late 4th century, perhaps even earlier, but it is clear from archaeological evidence that this synagogue rests upon the foundations of an earlier synagogue, the synagogue that is the setting for today's Gospel. I took this photograph of the synagogue ruins from the church built over the site of St. Peter's house, which is the setting for next Sunday's Gospel. The sign that you can see here tells us that the limestone, or so-called White Synagogue, was built upon the remains of the 1st century synagogue, the Synagogue of Jesus. The white limestone was brought from a distant quarry to this region of Black Balsat. A modern church, completed in 1990, has been built over the ruins of Peter's house. The floor of the church is made of thick glass, which enables visitors to look down onto the structure below. Ruins of Balsat stone houses are to the right. This aerial photo looking out towards the lake shows clearly the synagogue ruins and the modern church. And here you can see the modern church, the synagogue ruins, and the Franciscan friary in the background. So here is the site as you see it today from the lake. And this is what Capernaum might have looked like at the time of Jesus. So this is where today's Gospel is set. But the setting of any story also includes time. When is this story set? Firstly, Mark's Gospel is set in the 1st century AD, when Rome was the superpower of the day. Israel had been conquered by the Romans in 63 BC and is now a client state. Following the death of King Herod the Great in 4 BC, his kingdom was divided into 4. During the ministry of Jesus, Licinius was tetrarch of Abilene, Herod Antipas was tetrarch of Galilee, and Philip tetrarch of Trachonitis. By the time that Jesus began his public ministry, the Romans had taken direct responsibility for Judea, and Pontius Pilate was the 5th governor to have been appointed. The Roman governor was based on the coast at Caesarea, with a small military force. A much larger force of 4 legions was stationed further north in Syria. Augustus was the Roman emperor when Jesus was born, and Tiberius, the adopted son of Augustus, was emperor when Jesus was crucified. But there's another important time setting that we must be aware of. Jesus and his disciples are on the way to Jerusalem for the celebration of Passover. Passover, along with Pentecost and Tabernacles, was one of the 3 great pilgrimage festivals in the Jewish calendar. We read in the book of Exodus, 3 times a year you will hold a festival in my honour. 3 times a year all your menfolk will appear before the Lord Yahweh. As New Testament scholar Tom Wright points out, the most deeply formative narrative in all Judaism is the story of the Exodus, Israel's release from slavery in Egypt. Jacob's descendants have multiplied and have become slaves in Egypt. The Egyptians are harsh and bullying taskmasters. God hears the cry of his people and comes to deliver them. In the prelude to his Gospel, Mark has already subtly introduced the Exodus motif by telling us about the baptism of Jesus in the Jordan, and Jesus being led by God's Spirit into the desert for 40 days, where he was tested. The baptism of Jesus in the Jordan evokes 2 scenes from the Exodus story. The people passing through the waters of the sea at the beginning of the Exodus story, and Joshua parting the waters of the river Jordan so that the people could enter into the promised land. The testing of Jesus in the desert for 40 days evokes the 40 years the people wandered in the desert before entering the promised land. Those 40 years were also a time of testing. One of the interpretive keys to understanding the meaning of Jesus' death is this: Jesus chose Passover. In other words, Mark invites his audience very subtly to understand Jesus' death as a new and greater Passover, liberating God's people not from slavery in Egypt, but from the power of the evil one. One further aspect of setting that we must consider is this: what is the worldview reflected in Mark's Gospel? Mark's world is inhabited by demons and malign forces with which Jesus is constantly in conflict. This world is enemy-occupied territory. An evil power has made itself, for the present, the prince of this world. The world as a whole is the house of the strong one, Satan's territory. Satan is mentioned in chapters 1, 3, 4, and 8. In chapter 1 we have an unclean spirit and demons. Unclean spirit is Jewish terminology for a demon. In chapter 3, we again have unclean spirits and mention of Beelzebul, the ruler of demons. In chapter 5, we meet an unclean spirit who says his name is Legion, for there are many of us. In chapter 6, Jesus gives the 12 authority over unclean spirits. In chapters 6 and 7, we have demons. And again in chapters 7 and 9, we have an unclean spirit. What in the 21st century are we to make of Satan, demons, and unclean spirits? In the introduction to his book, The Screwtape Letters, C.S. Lewis offers this observation. There are two equal and opposite errors into which our race can fall about the devils. One is to disbelieve in their existence. The other is to believe and to feel an excessive and unhealthy interest in them. In his commentary on Mark's Gospel, A Costly Freedom, New Testament scholar Brendan Byrne writes this: "A healthy spirituality will acknowledge the reality of spiritual forces opposed to God and to life. But to take the gospel material as an invitation to see manifestations of the demonic or the devil everywhere is dangerous." Before we look more closely at today's gospel, let me make a general observation. Each of the four evangelists tells the story from a slightly different perspective. And that shouldn't surprise us. No two people will see each of us in exactly the same way. So, for example, the way your parents see you is going to be different from the way your own children see you. The way your spouse sees you will be different to the way in which your work confreres see you. And your friends will also see you differently. In a similar way, each of the four evangelists sees Jesus from a different perspective. But here's an interpretive key that enables us to gain an insight into the differing perspectives of each of the four evangelists. Look closely at the episode that the evangelist places at the beginning of Jesus' public ministry. It is a different episode in each of the four Gospels. In one sense, that introductory episode is programmatic. It functions as a lens through which we view the unfolding story. In John's Gospel, the introductory episode is the wedding feast of Cana, a story of wine in abundance. John's Gospel is about life in abundance. Jesus has come so that we may have life and have it in plenty. Luke begins the public ministry of Jesus with his return to Nazareth. Jesus had already moved to Capernaum, but he returns to his hometown and goes to the synagogue on the Sabbath day. The locals are amazed at his wisdom. But Jesus soon stirs up their fury by reminding them of two stories from the Scriptures. Firstly, an occasion on which God had sent the prophet Elijah to a widow in a Sidonian town during a time of drought and famine. And secondly, we have a story about the prophet Elisha healing a Syrian leper, Naaman. These two stories are about God's graciousness to outsiders, to two people who were not Jewish. Jesus in Luke's Gospel is the embodiment of God's hospitality. He welcomes the outsider. Matthew begins the public ministry of Jesus with what we call the Sermon on the Mount. Just as Moses ascended a mountain and received the Torah, Jesus also ascends a mountain and begins to teach. Jesus is a new and greater Moses. Today's Gospel is the first major episode in the public ministry of Jesus in Mark's Gospel. On the Sabbath day, Jesus and the 4 disciples whom he has just called go into the synagogue at Capernaum, and Jesus begins to teach. He taught the people with authority, unlike the scribes they were accustomed to. In the synagogue, he is confronted by a man with an unclean spirit. It's interesting to look at the literal translation of Mark's Greek, anthropos en pneumati agathato. It means literally a man in an unclean spirit. New Testament scholar Joel Marcus offers this observation. The terror of the scene is increased by the description of the demonic as a man in an unclean spirit. This phrase is usually interpreted as a Semitic idiom meaning a man with an unclean spirit. But a literal interpretation has a great deal to commend it. The man's personality has been so usurped by the demon that the demon has, as it were, swallowed him up. And isn't that the language that we often use about addiction? Our addictions devour us. As soon as Jesus appears on the scene and begins to teach, the demon feels the heat of his presence and realizes the threat that it represents. In a pathetic attempt to gain the upper hand, the demon names Jesus. "What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth?" The demon thinks it can gain some kind of power over Jesus because he can call him by name. In ancient magical texts, magicians often invoke the name of a god or demon and use the words, "I know you," or a similar formula in order to gain control over it. Here the situation is reversed. It is the demon that is trying to gain control over the exorcist. But Jesus is no ordinary exorcist. He comes rather as an agent of God's reign, in which there will be no room for demonic opposition to God. The unclean spirit asks, "Have you come to destroy us?" Here in chapter 1, we come to the question that encapsulates the whole mission of Jesus in Mark's Gospel. What Jesus now does in casting out an unclean spirit is a declaration of war. Remember the setting of Mark's Gospel. We are living in enemy-occupied territory, and we are powerless. The American theologian Fleming Rutledge writes this: "From beginning to end, the Holy Scriptures testify that the predicament of fallen humanity is so serious, so grave, so irremediable from within, that nothing short of divine intervention can rectify it. The human heart needs to be changed from the bottom up, but it cannot be changed by our natural strength and good works. It can be changed only by the intervening presence of the living God." What is happening in this synagogue at Capernaum is like D-Day, the 1944 Allied invasion of the beaches at Normandy in northern France, often referred to as the beginning of the end of World War II. By way of analogy, with this opening battle in the synagogue of Capernaum, the prince of this world is under attack. His reign is coming to an end. Or, to revert to a biblical metaphor, the new Exodus has now begun. As Brendan Byrne explains, in the person and actions of Jesus, the triune God breaks the captivity of the human race to the demonic, setting it free to become truly human. But it becomes clear as the gospel gets underway that the freedom proclaimed here will not come about without cost. A cost to Jesus, a cost to the Father, and a cost to those called to associate themselves with his life and mission. The story is told about a charismatic evangelist who could move congregations with his preaching. He travelled around the countryside, presenting himself as Jesus Christ returned to earth. He claimed to heal the sick, restore sight to the blind, to cast out devils, and to perform other miracles. He gathered an impressive following of those who believed in him, but also those who were merely curious. One evening he was preaching in a great hall in London. In the distance, outside the hall, the faint sound of music could be heard. The music grew louder, and louder, and louder still. It was the Salvation Army band, and it was approaching the hall. The small band of musicians burst into the hall with the beat of drums and tubas and trumpets blaring. They marched right down the centre aisle and stopped in front of the preacher's rostrum. The Salvation Army bandmaster motioned to the musicians, and the music ceased. He then turned to the speaker and asked, "Are you really the Christ? Tell us plainly." The preacher responded, "Yes, I am the Christ returned to earth." "Very well then," said the Salvation Army officer. "Show us your hands." The preacher extended his arms, and everyone saw his hands. There were no wounds. At that point, the band resumed the hymn they had been playing as they entered the hall. I shall know him by the print of the nails in his hand. This is the message of Mark's Gospel. Jesus has indeed come to set us free. The wounds of his passion are the price of that costly freedom.